The President, please be seated. The chamber is now back in session. We would like now to hand over to the co-prosecutor to proceed with his questions. Co-prosecutor, thank you, Mr. President. I would like to continue the questions. Mr. Sukun, I would like to move to another topic concerning the CPK strategy between before 1970, when there was an appeal and after that, when there was an appeal by then Prince Norodom Sihanouk. In Peking, when Mr. Ieng Sary was there, had he been contacted with the party's cadres or members of the resistance movement in the Fung or not, and how? Response. In Peking, Mr. Ieng Sary had a branch established there, and as a special envoy of the Grung, rather of Fung, representing from the internal side of Cambodia, he also conducted training sessions on politics at the political office of the Fung in Peking. Question. Were you aware of the relationship between him and the then Prince Norodom Sihanouk in the Fung? Response. The relationship between Samdechព្រះ Norodom Sihanouk and the representative of the Fung to Peking was a kind of matter that I do not know in details, because it was outside the ambit of my jurisdiction. Mr. Ieng Sary was representing the stance of the inside movement of the Fung, and he was representing the movement concerning the join in the conference in 1973, where the Vietnamese people also were to attend. At that time, Mr. Ieng Sary was representing Cambodia, and his position was very clear that there was no negotiation at all with the Lon Nol's regime, and he indicated clearly that we had to fight until the last drop of blood, and it was really different from the position by the Vietnamese counterpart at that time. Question. Could you describe the means of communication between then Samdechព្រះ Norodom Sihanouk and the inside resistance movement in Cambodia? Response. At that time, the channel of communications between King Sihanouk and people inside was done through a visit of the king in Cambodia in March. It was a crossroad that had been walked concerning the position of Samdech Sihanouk and people inside to agree to free the country from them. Question: could you also elaborate further concerning the relationship the communication between Mr. Ieng Sary and the local resistance movement? How could these communications take place? Response: at that time, Mr. Ieng Sary activity with members in Peking were secret. In particular, his communication with people inside the country was not known to me. Question: did the Communist Party of Cambodia on that date, as I indicated earlier, regard Samdech Norodom Sihanouk as what inside the party? Response: honestly, I don't know. Question: did you ever know the Sihanoukist or Sihanoukist? What does this term refer to, and who created such movement, and for what purpose? Response: I used to hear the expression, but I did not know who was the founder of such a movement. But so far as I know, it must have been those who supported Norodom Sihanouk. And this line was very clear that Cambodia had to be neutral. The neutral policy had to be followed both inside and outside the country, and they also took the middle path, which means that Cambodians had to be united, and there should not be leftist or rightist. Question: did you ever hear the strategic force and tactical forces? What were these terms meant to express, and for what reason were they found? Response: I believe that these were the tactical strategies or the functioning of the CPK. The strategic forces refer to the long-term forces. If we refer to the classes, they could have been the peasant and worker classes. The tactical forces refer to the alliance based on the actual historical circumstance. These forces were gathered in accordance with the circumstance of the resistance movement. These forces had to be attached to the strategic forces. However, when we move to the social revolution, the latter forces had to be abandoned, because we already had the peasant and the worker class, which were the core forces for the leadership. Question. To hold power as they wished, according to your best recollection, did the CPK have any plan, or how did it plan to distinguish between Sihanoukist or supporters and those who were the CPK followers? Response. My understanding is that Sihanouk forces were the tactical forces. At the same time, the CPK selected some individuals who could join the party from the beginning until its completion. They were regarded as the tactical forces, but secondary as opposed to the strategic forces. But at the same time, some individuals from the tactical forces could be regarded as the long-term forces for the movement. Question. The next question will be about the positions, about power within the Funk and the Grunk. These are the individuals I would like to read to you, and could you confirm what position they held back then? Number 1, Mr. Sarancha. Response. Mr. Sarancha was the member of the political office of the Funk and also member of the Grunk. Question. What about Mr. Hood Sambat? Response. Mr. Hood Sambat was also a member of the political office of the Funk and the minister of the Grunk government. Question. Could you please be more precise? What kind of position they were holding? For example, Mr. Sarancha, what ministry was he the minister of? Response. I remember that Mr. Saranchak was the Minister of Foreign Affairs Ministry. Mr. Hood Sambat held a position as the minister, but I don't remember of which ministry he was the minister. Question. What about Mr. Chan Yuran, the third person here? Response. Mr. Chan Yuran was also a member of the political office of the Funk and the Minister of Education of the Grunk. Question. What about Mr. Chia San? Response. Mr. Chia San was also the member of the political office of the Funk and the Minister of Justice of the Grunk. Question number 5. Mr. Kiet Chun. Response. Mr. Kiet Chun was a reserve candidate or member of the political office of the Funk and the minister attached to the cabinet of ministers of the Grunk. Number 6, say the co-prosecutor, Mr. Chun Prasad. Response. Mr. Chun Prasad was a reserve member of the political office of the Funk and the minister coordinating the resistance movement of the Grunk. Question number 7, Mr. Wan Pini. Response. Mr. Wan Pini was the Deputy Prime Minister.
លោកកៅ
Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs, rather. Question. What about Mr. Cao Mia? Response. Mr. President, could you ask Mr. Co-Prosecutor to be more precise whether Cao Mia or Cai Mia? Co-Prosecutor, Cai Mia. Response. Cai Mia was the former leader of the CPK. Question number 9. Mr. E. Sup Kunthi. Response. Mr. E. Sup Kunthi was the Chargé d'Affaires. Question. Was he also a member of the CPK? Response. No, he wasn't. Question number 10. Mr. Chao Sing. Response. Mr. Chao Sing was a member of the political office of the Funk and the minister of or in charge of a special mission of the Grunk. Question number 11. General Duong Som Ol. Response. General Duong Som Ol was also a member of the political office of the Funk and the minister of in charge of weaponry of the Grunk. Question number 12. Mr. Chuan Mom. Response. Mr. Chuan Mom was also the member of the political office of the Funk, also the minister of finance of the Grunk. Question. The third person here is Mr. En Sok Khan. Response. Mr. President, En Sok Khan or En Sok Khan? Prosecutor En Sok Khan. Response. Mr. En Sok Khan was the representative of the Funk and the Grunk at the same time to France. Question. Thank you, Mr. Sikun. I would like to have a few more questions to you. Among these individuals who were ministers and diplomats of the Funk and the Grunk, did they work or rather between 1975 to 1979 was any of them arrested, and if so, why were they arrested? Response. I have no idea what happened to the arrest. Question. Amongst these individuals, as I indicated, had anyone worked under the direct supervision of Mr. Ieng Sari? Response. Among these people, the 13 people, there were only Mr. Kitchun and Chun Prosetta who worked at the MFA under the supervision of Mr. Ieng Sari. Question. I would like to move to another topic concerning the delegation of the Grunk abroad. My next question would be, did Mr. Ieng Sari and Khieu Samphan travel or pay a visit to a European country, and to which country and when? Response. They were there on early April in 1974. Mr. Kilsompon and Ieng Sary led a group of delegation of the Funk and Grunk to visit Yugoslavia, Romania, and Albania. Question. What about a trip to Africa? Did they both go to this country, and to which countries in the continent? Response. I believe they went to Algeria, Mauritania, and Egypt, and another country that I don't recollect. Question. During the trips to these two continents, did you accompany or ever accompany them? Response. Yes, I did, in my capacity as an assistant to the delegation led by Kilsompon and Ieng Sary. Question. What was the purpose of the trip or the visit? Response. The visit was to inform our friend countries about the Cambodian resistance movement and the position of the Krunk and Funk. Concerning the conference, the peace accord abroad with regard to the Cambodian support of this. Question. I would like to know your background of activities. In these two institutions, the Funk and the Grunk, in which institution did you work for the most, and in what capacity? Response. It is not possible to distinguish between the work in the Funk and the Grunk, and as a member of the CPK, our primary objective of each individual, of each member, was to fulfill our work as a communist to the best of our capacity and in line with the political line. So we can't distinguish the task between these two institutions. Question. When did you last leave China? Response. I left China in 1974. Question. Where did you head to after leaving China? Response. At that time, in my capacity as a member of the party, and it was very honored as an individual who was in the resistance movement and as an intellectual who had better education and spent so much time abroad, our main purpose was to return to Cambodia to enjoy living peacefully with our people, to contribute to the resistance movement as guided by the party. Question. You said you left China in 1974. Do you still recall the exact date, month, and day, for example? Response: it was as early as May, after the Cambodian delegation led by Mr. Khieu Samphan and Ieng Sary to the East European countries. It was, so far as I recall, on the early April, rather May 1974. Question: did you ever travel to Vietnam or any other countries after returning from China? Response: I went to Vietnam in 1970 in May, accompanying Samdech Norodom Sihanouk as when he was the head of the Grung to visit Vietnam. And I returned to Cambodia in May in 1974 from China. I stayed for a while in Hanoi. Question: when you were in Vietnam, did you see Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan there? Response: in 1974, when I went to Vietnam, I was traveling with both of them. Question: you left Cambodia for Vietnam with these two people on which date? Could you please tell us the date? Response: it was in May 1974. Indeed, the trip that was made after the trip to Laos and also the trip to the liberated zone in South Vietnam. Question: how long was the visit to Vietnam? Response: I don't remember for sure, but it was not short. It was at least 1 week, because the trip was important for the resistance movement. Question: in Vietnam, you said you saw Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan. What did they do back then? Response: I joined in their activities in negotiating officially with the leadership of Vietnam and also attended the banquet with students, but I did not know the details of the important matters being discussed.
Did you hear about the liberated zone of Cambodia? Where was the zone? Response: at that time, the liberated zone was almost throughout the country, except the surrounding areas around Phnom Penh and certain provincial towns. Question: did you ever make a trip to the liberated zone? Response: when I returned to the liberated zone. Phnom Penh was liberated on the 17th April 1975. Question: did you ever observe Ieng Sary Khieu Samphan make a trip to the liberated zone in Cambodia? Response: in May 1974, after the visit by the delegation headed by Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan to the Liberated Zone in Laos and the South Vietnam. Ieng Theret and myself returned to Hanoi in order to continue our task at the radio station of the Phunk. As for Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan, the two returned back to the country, to the liberated zone. Question: does this mean Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan continue their journey to the liberated zone after the two of them returned from Vietnam? Is that correct? Response: yes. Thank you. Question: how many days after Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan left Beijing to Cambodia, what was the purpose of them leaving Beijing? Response: that was the time the war was intensified between the resistant forces who gathered up within the Phunk and the Grunk against the forces of the Marshal Lon Nol, supported by Americans. As a leader of the resistance movement, the two had the obligation to return to join the resistance in the country. Question: can you tell us, after Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan decided to return to country and to the liberated zone, how did they travel? By what means? And which areas did they pass through from Vietnam to Cambodia? Response: my apology, I cannot know that detail. Question: can you tell us the reason that Ieng Sary and Khieu Samphan had to wait for quite a long while at the liberated zone, although they wanted to return to Cambodia as early as possible? Mr. President, could you ask the prosecutor to clarify the question? Prosecutor: the question is, I want to know the reasons why Khieu Samphan and Ieng Sary had to wait for a long time at the liberated zone inside Cambodia, even though they wanted to return to Cambodia as soon as they could. Why did they have to wait for such a long time? The witness: Mr. President, my apology. I still cannot understand the question put to me by the prosecutor. At that time, Cambodia was divided into two. One was under the control, which was called the Liberty Zone by our group, and the other part was controlled by the Lon Nol's regime. And I'd like the prosecutor to ask me again. The prosecutor: let me move on to another question, as this question is not really of that importance. My next question is in relation to another topic, that is the radio of the radio station of the Phunk in Hanoi. Mr. Suong Sikun, can you tell us what was the reason for the establishment of the radio station of the Phunk in Hanoi? Response. I do not know the exact reason for that. However, as I said earlier, our resistance movement at the time was that the Cambodian people, the Vietnamese people, and the Laotian people faced a common enemy. Mr. President, what I say is a historical context. And there is nothing else in what I say. We all face the same common enemy, and the three regimes in each respective country was a kind of a puppet country of the Americans. And for that reason, it is important to have a common struggle among the three people and support one another. And one form of the support of the Communist Party of Vietnam for the CPK was their permission for us to have our radio station on the territory of the People's Republic of Vietnam. Thank you. Question. Can you tell us in regards to the establishment of the radio station in Hanoi, who was the main supporter? Response. As far as I know, Vietnam at the time provided us the support in the form of the space and some technical staff to a limited degree. However, when it comes to the resistance by the Cambodians, the Vietnamese government allowed us to act independently. Thank you. Question. Regarding the Cambodian staff working for that radio station, how were they recruited and from what source? Response. The Cambodian staff working in that radio station of the Phunk were the former resistance. They were recruited amongst the former resistance. And we have one main news broadcaster who was an old hand and experienced. And also we recruited staff from the fine arts. And others were intellectuals, including myself, who were patriots, who wanted to enter the country, but due to the circumstance and necessity, in order to contribute to the voice at the radio station, those intellectuals stayed and worked at that radio station. Thank you. Question. The Cambodian staff who worked there, were they or had they been members of the CPK or member of the Phunk? Or what were they? Response. Majority of the staff, as far as I know, were members of the CPK. However, there was a small number who were not members of the CPK. In the communist movement, they were labeled as the sympathizers. Thank you. Question. What was the code name for that radio station of the Phunk, if you can recall? Response. No, I do not know the code name for that radio station. Officially, it was known as the Voice of the Phunk. Thank you. Questions regarding the programs broadcast on the radio were who actually controlled the programs broadcast on that radio station? Response. Speeches or main text were brought out from the country, and some other information related to foreign affairs were produced on the spot. And those oversaw the overseas segment was Internet, who was the director. Thank you. So, as you just stated, Internet was the director of the radio station of the Phung. Does it mean she was the highest leader for that radio station? Response. In terms of the political role of the radio station, in general, she was not the most responsible. She was only in charge of the segment under her supervision. Thank you. Question. Since the establishment of the radio station, what was the main target of the audience? Was it for the resistance movement inside the country or for overseas? Response. The radio station represented the voice of the resistance movement of the Cambodian people at the time, both inside the country and overseas. Thank you. Question. In what languages was the radio broadcast? Response. It was only broadcast in the Khmer language. Question. In the programs broadcast in the Khmer language by the radio station, for what programs were you in charge? Response. I was in charge of the international news. Question. Before the broadcast of the international news oversaw by you, who would be the immediate supervisor who would control that segment above you? Response. It was Internet who would oversee the text that I wrote and broadcast. Thank you. Question. Did Ieng Sari and Khieu Sampon give you instructions regarding the radio broadcast, or did they ever give instructions to other staff concerning the broadcast on the radio at the time? Response. It seems none, because it did not fall under their authority. Thank you. Question. Until when the radio finished their broadcast? Response. I do not know. What I knew was that the radio broadcast until the 17th April 1975. That was the time I returned to Cambodia. The radio on that day broadcast about the victory on the 17th April 1975. Thank you. Question. Can you recall which public frequency the radio was broadcast and who decided on its frequency? Response. I cannot recall the frequency of the broadcast or who actually authorized for the broadcast on that frequency. Question: regarding the general information and the important information, what was the main point of these two kinds of information? Response: important information would encompass the speeches, which were the core news, as well as reports from the battlefields. Question: could you tell us the main sources of your information and how did you obtain that information? Respond: the editorials and the news from the battlefield were obtained from inside the country through the use of the coding system. Thank you. Question: who were the translators who translated information from the foreign news into the Khmer language? President: witness, you do not need to respond to this question. This question is, of course, not relevant and further away from the scope of the facts in the closing order. Thank you, Mr. President. I move on. The President, please try to orient your questions to the facts before us. It seems that you are wandering here and there for the whole afternoon. Thank you. Now I move on to another topic regarding the return to Cambodia from Hanoi and the working at B20. Witness, can you tell us what B20 was? Response: during the time that I stayed at B20, it was an office that cadres from overseas stayed provisionally before they moved to other locations. That's all I knew. I did not know any other details regarding this office. Question: where was B20 located and what was its function? Response: B20 was located at Steng Trong district. It was a production site. There were a lot of trees. There were banana trees, durian, mangoes, etc. The soil there was rich and good for fruits. Question: who was the head of B20? Response: I cannot recall. During the time that I stayed there, I saw the head, but I cannot recall the name. Maybe I can recall later on. Question: during your stay at B20, whom did you see working there? Response: during my stay, I did not know anybody whom I knew previously, and there were not many people there. Question: upon your arrival in Cambodia, who actually sent you to work and stay at B20? Response: as I knew, the order came in systematically and from the above for those who had to go here or there. Thank you. Question. What was the real nature of the establishment of B20? Response. I do not know, as I believe there was no real intensive purpose of the establishment of B20, as there was no real intensive training or education. There were, of course, a weekly meeting, but everything was not in detail. Question. Did you ever see the Khmer students and intellectuals? Where were they sent to? Response. No, I do not know. Question. Were they, or were some of them ever sent to B20? Response. During my transit there, besides my group, I did not see any other student or intellectual from overseas. Question. After you work at B20, where else was you transferred to? Response. After B20, I went to stay at a house which was known as a pink house of Teh Pokulab in Khmer. It was near the riverfront and it belonged to the Princess Nulea, who was also the wife of then Prince Sihanouk. Mr. President, I have 5 more questions before I conclude my part. And tomorrow, then my international counterpart will continue. Mr. Sosikun, I'd like to ask you regarding the evacuation of people from Phnom Penh. Did you see the evacuation? And if so, in what scale? Response. When I went to Phnom Penh, the evacuation was almost complete. I entered Phnom Penh on the 20th of May 1975. Questioned. What was the reason for the evacuation of people from Phnom Penh and who made that decision? Response. Regarding the purpose of the evacuation, as I was told, was that now, as the Americans planned to bombard Phnom Penh city, and number 2, if all the people in Phnom Penh were not to leave, they would be starved, as there was not sufficient rice and supplied for these millions of people in a city. And the third reason was that the evacuation from Phnom Penh was to disperse the spy network of the enemy. Question. During the evacuation of Phnom Penh from the people from Phnom Penh to the countryside, did you know whether the people at the base welcomed the new evacuees from Phnom Penh? Response: I cannot know about that as I was in the city then. Question number 4. It is in relation to Pol Pot and Ieng Sary and Khisampon. This is my second last question. Did you know if Pol Pot gave instructions to Ieng Sary as he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs in relation to the policies of Democratic Cambodia? Response: No, I do not know. That was the affairs between the two. This is my last question. Besides Pol Pot, was there any meeting between the senior cadres of Democratic Cambodia in relation to the foreign policy where Mr. Ieng Sary was the minister? For example, if Nunchi Khisampon held a meeting in this regard? Response: I do not know. At that time, I was working at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the three had the duties and stayed elsewhere, and I did not have the right to know about their affairs and work. Prosecutor: Thank you, Mr. President, for allowing me to put questions to the witness, and thank you, Mr. Sikun, for allowing me to ask you questions. Now I conclude my part. President: Thank you, Mr. Witness. Mr. Sung Sikun, the hearing of your testimony is not yet concluded, and we will continue next week, starting on Monday, and you are invited to return on that day. Likewise, the Duty Council, you are invited to return as well on Monday next week. Court officer, in cooperation with WISU, please arrange for the return of the witness to his residence and have him return by Monday next week before 9 a.m. Today, hearing has come to a conclusion. We will now adjourn and resume on the 6th of August 2012, starting from 9 a.m. And we will continue to hear the testimony of the witness Sung Sikun, who will again be questioned by the prosecution. Security guards, you are instructed to take the three accused back to the detention facility and have them return to the courtroom on Monday next week prior to 9 a.m. The court is now adjourned.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ